All right, hello everybody. This screencast is going to be for the introduction to Unit 3, and Unit 3 is on for loops and sequences. So I'm going to walk through some slides to introduce some of the concepts for at least the start of this unit. So we are continuing to learn about the three main logical structures that we can find in algorithms and write into our code. We've gone through linear sequences, selection sequences, and then repetition sequences. So we've covered them all, but you'll notice that there are two types of repetition sequences that we can have. Last unit, we looked at while loops. And in this unit, we're going to add the other type, which is for loops. Now, before we can get too far into for loops, we need to talk a little bit about sequences. A sequence is an ordered list of elements. And the only one we've covered so far are strings. So we're going to use strings as an example. If you think about a string, it's really just an ordered list of like characters, an ordered list of character elements. So they can be numbers, they can be spaces, they could be letters, but the string hello, as an example, is not the same as hello backwards, right? Hello not equal to LA is true, right? That's a true statement. So strings have to be in the same order in order to be the same, right? That's why we say they're an ordered list of elements. An element, when we say element, we're talking about just one item in that sequence. So the H in hello is one element in the sequence hello. So for example, H in hello evaluates to true, right? Because we can find an H in hello. Right? And once we understand what a sequence is, we quickly learn that we can step through those. And when you step through a sequence in order and access one of those items at a time, you are iterating through that sequence. So there's a new vocab term, iterate, that we're going to use often in this unit, which leads us to discussing a for loop more. So a for loop can execute a certain number of times. It's similar to like the count controlled while loops that we did, where we had just a while loop with a count variable that incremented and counted up to a certain number. So, for example, we counted up to 10 with a while loop. And a for loop will execute the loop body for every item in a sequence. And that's why sometimes it's referred to as a for each loop. Right? When you execute one iteration of the loop, that is one time through the loop body. All right, so an iteration is just one execution of the loop body. So we can say that a for loop then iterates through a sequence, executes the loop body for each element in that sequence. Myself around here a little bit. All right, so if we look at a string, in this case we have the string computer science, and stored that into a variable we're just going to name sequence. We've covered that this is a sequence, right? Computer science is made up of the characters, C, O, M, P, etc. And with a for loop, the for statement is going to look like this, where we can say for item in sequence, print item. And if we look at that in flowchart form on the right-hand side over here, you can see that with a for loop, the conditional statement is checking if all of the items in the sequence have had their turn, right? So this for loop will step through the sequence computer science. Each iteration of the loop body, in this case it's printing item, right? It's going to assign the next item in our sequence computer science to the loop variable. In this case, if you recall the loop variable term from last unit with while loops, the loop variable in this case is going to be item. right? So every item in the sequence is going to be every character in the sequence computer science, right? And then every time we access a new character, we're going to execute the loop body. In this case, it prints the item. So it's going to print each character of this sequence of this string, right? And it's important to note that with a for loop, the diamond is an implicit condition handled by the for statement. So you don't have to write that loop condition like we did with while loops where you're checking every time around. A for loop just iterates through the sequence. It just goes from the beginning to the end, and when it gets to the end and accesses the last item, it won't loop again. All right, so it'll be done once it's done with the sequence. All right, so the for item in sequence part of this, right? The for statement, like we said, is an implicit condition, so it's checking to see if all the items have been executed, and then assigning, right, using that looping variable item to the next item in the sequence, next element in the sequence. And then the print item is where you're executing every statement. That's the loop body. Okay, so another code example. For letter in computer science, print letter. In pseudocode, we could say for the loop variable is letter, and then we use the in operator followed by a sequence. In this case, the sequence is the string computer science, and the statements to be repeated are our loop body, right? And if we ran this output, every iteration of the loop, we're going to access a new letter from our sequence. So starting with C, and it will print, starting and moving on to O, M. Right? So the letter in our for statement gets assigned sequentially through the string, accesses each item, including the space, and then just prints it out. We know the print will print on a new line, so the output will look like this. Looking a little more carefully at the components of the for loop with some color coding here. So the for statement is just going to be starting with the for keyword, ending with the colon, just like while and if statements do as well. The loop variable we said is whatever you call, whatever you're using to access the items in the sequence. So whatever you call the second term in your for statement. So for letter, you'll see for I in a lot, but you get to make this up. And this is a different, this variable gets initialized differently than most variables. Usually with variables, we need an assignment statement. With a for loop, by putting the variable here, it initializes it for you the first iteration of the loop where it will access the C in computer science. The in operator, we've looked at that just a little bit before, or where we've looked in strings for something. It's just a keyword that's going to access the different items in our sequence. And then the sequence in this case, the only one we've seen so far, the only sequence we know is a string, so that's why we're using that as an example. But again, it's an ordered list of items, like a string is an ordered list of characters. Right? And then lastly, the loop body is the indented portion of the code. It's the indented block containing the statements that you're going to repeat over and over again. All right, so this example, we're going to run through something called the Python visualizer. And again, this is what the output's going to look like from that execution. But let's step through this and visualize this using this tool. All right, what this tool allows you to do, if you haven't seen it yet, is allows you to step through code line by line and then visualize that execution over here on the right-hand side. The output will show up in this box right here. And then different objects and different variables and stuff will show up down here in this area. Okay. All right. The red arrow, as you can see, points to the next line of code to be executed, and then a greenish line will show up to show the line that was just executed. So if we step once into this, we can see that the first line of code assigns the word computer science to the word variable, right? So in the global scope of our program, there's a variable called word, stores the value computer science, okay? And then we're gonna step and execute the first pass of our for loop. Right, you can see what happens when you execute line 2 is that our for statement accesses the first element in the sequence computer science, the string computer science, assigns a letter variable, which I initialize in my for loop to be C, okay? And then the next line of code is the loop body that will execute, which will print the letter. So we can see in our output up here, a C gets printed, right? And the next iteration of the loop for letter in word is going to access the next letter in the word. So we can see down here, letter variable has been updated and is now accessing the second element in our sequence computer science, the O. It'll print that. And so on and so forth. If I step through this, you can see it's just going to toggle back and forth between lines 2 and 3. It's going to slowly move through our string computer science, right? And then every time it gets to the loop body, it's going to go ahead and print that element. So we'll move through this down so you can see. And then once it got to the end, the very last iteration of the loop, letter is E at the end of our sequence. Right? And then the last pass, the last line executed was line 2. Once it got to this for statement and there were no more letters in the word computer science, the loop ends automatically. Right? So that's how the loop would end. So like I said, we only know at this point one type of sequence, which is a string. Another type of sequence we're going to learn right away at the beginning of this unit is called a range of values, a range of numbers. And to work with range, you have to be able to work with the range function, which returns an immutable sequence of integers of type range. So the example here is rather than having a string, right, which are all just characters, now we can have integer values stored in a series of values, in a sequence of values. So an example here might be the numbers 1 through 10 might look like this, if you could visualize the range. So starting at the integer 1, ending at the integer 10. An important fact about a range is that it is immutable, right? So once you create a range, you cannot change it. And that's what immutable means, a type that cannot be changed once created. The range function can accept 3 arguments. So the only one you have to pass to it is the ending value, which is exclusive. But you have the option of also passing a starting value. You have the option of also passing a step value. Let's see what that looks like in a second here. All right, this is a common, the most common use of a range is to use it with for loops to create loops that run a certain number of times, right? If you wanted to run a loop that ran 10 times, you might create a range of 10 just to run something 10 times. And that's going to be our example we're going to use here. So if you have range 10, that will create a range of 10 values starting at 0, right, ending at 9, right, because the argument is exclusive in this case. This is the ending value, which is exclusive. If you wanted to create the numbers 1 through 10, you'd have to start at 1 and go up 2, but not including 11. Right? So your range in that case would look like this. And then including the optional step value, right? If you wanted to step by 5s, starting at 0, going up 2, but not including 30, your resulting range from the range function would look like this. You'd have 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Okay, so if we look at an example then, all right, let's do one that uses all three arguments. So if you want to do the numbers 1 through 10, for each number in the range 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, not including 11, stepping by 1 each time and printing the number every time around a loop, what you're going to get. So again, the loop variable in this case is going to be num. The sequence is going to be my range 1 through 10. And then every time around the loop, I'm just going to print. So you might be able to anticipate, but the output in this case, each time around this loop, the number is going to access the next element in our range. So it's going to end up looking like this. All right, if we visualize this as another example. So in this case, we can create a number range, which is just a variable I'll create to hold on to my range of 1 through 10. So range 1, 11, 1. Right? And then we'll loop through that number range. So for num in number range, print num. So if we execute this loop, you can see that line 1 will create a number range variable, right, which actually creates this range object, which is a type of value, and the range is 1, 11, which represents 1 through 10. If we step through the first pass of our for statement, the num loop variable will be assigned to the first element in this range. So num gets assigned to 1, and then we'll print 1. And then num is going to be sequentially assigned to every element in the range. So now it's going to be 2 and printed, 3 and printed, 4 and printed. All right, so again, num is accessing every item in the sequence just like it was with our string computer science, but now it's just a bunch of numbers. So these are not strings being printed now, they're integer values being printed. And 9. And then the last element in this range is going to be assigned 10 and printed. And then the last pass of the for statement, there are no more elements left in our range. Right, so the for loop will see that and end itself. All right. And those are two examples we'll use at the beginning. Later this unit, we'll look at a third type of sequence called a list, which is going to be similar to a range, but it's going to be, it will be mutable. So we'll be able to change the values in it. And I guess we'll also look at something called a tuple, which is another immutable type of value that's going to be similar to a range, but can hold on to any type of value, not just integers.